Good morning, everybody. We're just going to give a few minutes. We will be starting at just after 11. I see people are joining in. So we will be starting just after 11. The main plenary session just ended, and I see people are starting to come in.
Good morning.
Good morning again, and welcome to all the participants, the presenters. Thank you for joining. I think this is a great program that we had so far, and thank you very much for KwaZulu-Natal, University of KwaZulu-Natal, the Inclusive Cities section, ISOCOP, SA Cities Network, eThekwini, University of Johannesburg, University of Venda, and obviously SACPLAN for arranging and organizing this international symposium on inclusive cities. We have heard over the last 2 days so far quite interesting discussions and topics that we've been exploring. We're now in day 2, room 1. Twinning urban environmental and climate change towards clean, healthy and secure cities for all. So this is the session. There's also other rooms. So this is the room that you are currently in. And there's also a synopsis in the program. I'm just going to touch on a few things there that is also mentioned there. It is saying that the current adaptation practices are largely focusing on adapting to climate disturbances instead of adapting with the vulnerable urban populations. And we've also just heard from the plenary speaker in the session before the vulnerable and how mega projects can impact those as well. The proponents of this trajectory have been accused of missing out on opportunities such as those that emerge when climatic risks are jointly treated with environmental sustainability concerns. This pathway involves hurried responses to climate change, external stimuli, and ignores internal urban processes. We've also heard comments on not only urban but also rural processes, and we should not lose sight of the rural part as well. what is also being said is that adaptation practices, if these are hastily executed, they are likely to miss on opportunities to address underlying non-climatic drivers of vulnerability, which lead to sustainable development failures. And I think that is something that we should not lose sight of. As I indicated, the synopsis is listed in the program, so please go and have a look at that, read it, and then we can even discuss that when we go through the program itself. Please also allow me to welcome my co-chairs, Mrs. Mkhize and Mr. Robert. I see there's no surname there, so welcome co-chairs. And I also want to acknowledge the presenters. I've seen most of them are on the group. I am not sure. There's one presenter, Architect Kumar, that I have not seen as yet. But I assume that Architect Kumar will be joining us a bit later. So I also just want to ask the presenters, we've got 20 minutes per presentation, so I'm going to ask you to stick within those time frames, that we can fully explore the 10 minutes of questions after each of the presentations. So I'm going to urge you to also stick within those time frames. So I want to go right over to the first speaker. Let me just get the right day here in front of me. The first speaker is Mrs. Elizabeth Bell-Pear, with the topic Time for Inclusive Transformation, Spatial Planning for Intertwined Health and People and Planet. Elizabeth is an engineer, an architect, and an urban regional planner with over 25 years of experience across scales and contexts: architecture, urban design and regeneration, urban regional planning in Belgium, France, Switzerland, West Bank. It's clear from a bio that she's got a wide range of experience. With UN Habitat, disaster risk reduction and sustainable development in Vietnam, post-conflict programs in Kosovo, and creation of new strategic integrated planning systems, development of regional capacity building instruments addressing informal settlements with Southeast European governments and partners in investment banks. I'm going to give right over to Mrs. Bell-Pear. I assume that you do have a presentation, so you're welcome to put up the presentation, ma'am, yep. And then we can jump right in.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for putting such a critical topic on the agenda. The world is failing because not single one country in the world is providing children with a healthy life and a climate fit for their future. This is a message of a key global landmark report that actually went under the radar as the COVID outbreak spread across the world last year. No country is adequately protecting children's health, their environment, and their future in face of environmental and existential threats. The climate emergency is rapidly undermining the future of the survival of all species and the likelihood of a world in which all the children enjoy the right to health is increasingly out of reach. The impact of this is not equitable and not just. Think of DRC, for instance, in the past 2 months, had an enormous destruction of homes, schools, livelihoods, and the warming of the lake also threatens their transport, trade, and displacement. But the future is also unequal, and especially those at risk are the poor, female, disabled, indigenous, and from racial, ethnic, and sexual minorities, vulnerable in unequal societies. And even as the pandemic is a global health issue, an even bigger one, as we all know, is climate change. And the next 4 months running up to the COP26 is in fact a critical window for decision making. And we should use that opportunity to radically re-question our assumptions, but also re-question and rethink for whom and what our cities and our open spaces are for. Who do they serve? Who do they exclude? And the overarching question could be, are we making the world better for our children? I make a quick detour via the brain to understand why that is important, because in the first 1,000 days of a child's life, 1 million neural connections are formed every second. And by age 5, 90% of the brain is developed. Neuroscience tells us that the environment in which children grow up and have social experiences, they shape the young brains with lifelong impacts. So the environment that we as planners plan and design have lifelong impacts on the foundation for future health, happiness, and prosperity. But also adolescence, youth, is a second crucial window in brain development and an opportunity. It's a turbocharged time when young people gain cognitive, physical, and social skills to thrive as an adult. And investing in youth has triple benefits for the young people now, them later as a parent, and also intergenerational for the next generation. So imagine creating an environment that young people can thrive. But with human and planet health under increasing stresses, we need to catapult health and well-being on top of the agenda. Reconnect with nature for climate, biodiversity, and health, 3 top global crises. And putting young ones at the center also means a radical change in rethinking neighborhoods, supporting caregivers and their spatial patterns of mobility, reconnecting with nature, etc. But apart from these 3 global challenges, and quick look back at some of the other ones that are important too and shape our health and development of cities. Today's urbanization is unprecedented in speed and scale. 1.4 million people added to cities every week, and 60% of urban development or urban environment yet has to be built. So this has also opportunities. The urbanization is going faster than many city governments can cope with, resulting in unsustainable growth. And as we know, slums, administrations and budgets are siloed. They can be overlapping, inefficient, and often not equipped to deal with complex challenges as we have today. But also inequity has increased, not between countries, but within cities, with low-income neighborhoods, young people of color and girls disproportionately disadvantaged. And COVID has amplified some of these spatial and health inequities. The world, at the other hand, has more young people than ever before, and especially Africa important, as the average age is 20 years old. The majority, they grow up in cities. And by 2030, largest number will be under 18. Surprisingly, they're not on the agenda, not on the COVID agenda and the climate agenda. We also know that diversity is increasing, and so is youth diversity. Just have a look here. And so it means that we have to re-question our assumptions and planning cities with the average city in mind, or the average citizen in mind. Because even under young people, an older teen, for instance, can be an immigrant, a parent, a student at the same time. In fact, we're talking about the majority of minorities. We know that air pollution is a key global issue in climate, but again, think of children, because we know that adults take 12 to 18 breaths per minute, while infants take 30 to 60. And we know that 9 of 10 of us live in areas with unhealthy levels of air pollution. And the other pandemic is the NCDs and obesity. Harvard study telling us that 60% of today's children will be obese by their 35th birthday. And this impacts their life, their qualities, but also budget and investments. Another important aspect is that since the 70s, in 4 generations, the freedom of roaming of young people has decreased. So the children's physical worlds have shrunk. In cities, public space is eaten away at a high rate or privatized. And Richard Louv speaks of a nature deficit disorder, because never in history young people were so disconnected with nature. And even if we look at the micro scale, we see that devices are built in to exclude rather than include. This is a skate stopper, for instance. But we have an opportunity, and with a critical role for nature and open natural space, and also a critical role for our neighborhood, because that's where we can dive into the daily lives of people and into communities. And there's also a good platform for inclusion and participation. So what are some of the building blocks at different scales where we can promote the intertwined health of environment and people? This is Ghent. It's a city in Belgium. And it's an example of urban planning expanding public space. It's a neighborhood, one of the densest in the city, one of the poorest. More than half of the population is of foreign origin. And thinking long term, over 15 years, the city turned private properties and garages, empty industrial buildings, dilapidated houses into public spaces and parks, and did this without minor displacement of inhabitants. It's important because cities today, they are absorbing more and more land at the cost of natural environment. In that region, for instance, 12 football fields are disappearing in the region. It's also important because this is guaranteeing or realizing a more equitable distribution of green and natural areas in the city. It has been a long-term process, and of course it comes with difficult negotiations and a delicate balance. But this has created over time new public spaces with their own identity that then have been connected with the green network for walking and cycling. And I refer back to the daily life. These are two people. This is Jasmine, 24, for instance. She grew up in that neighborhood, and the neighborhood was getting more diverse. As she would walk from park to park after school, that was actually the reason also why her parents let her free and trusted it. So while she was growing up, she gained gradual freedom in the neighborhood and made cross-cultural bonds. Mohammed, for him, was the connection with nature, one that focused on mental, spiritual, and a healing effect. He's a shy man, and he told me how little self-confidence he had and how he suffered from depression and had an identity crisis like a lot of young people in cities today because they deal with multiple identities. He took antidepressants, but also took the effort to spend time in a nearby natural area, a natural area that the city now had made available for, it's a natural protected area, but it's available for residents. And the whole project was called Oxygen in the Neighborhood. So Mohammed is exploring nature and then in his own street started to service his neighbors and growing small vertical gardens at the facade of their house. The city has now made this initiative possible for citizens, and they don't even need a permit to do this anymore. So this became part of enabling growing green in your street. So for Mohammed, nature is neutral. It didn't judge him, and it helps young people blossom. The new green standard for Ghent is now that within every residence distance of 400 meters, you have to have 10 square meters of green within a park of minimum of 1 hectare. We go to Barcelona, and you probably noticed this is an integrated concept called superblocks. So the city carved out 9 blocks, and they removed passing through traffic and turned it into citizen space. It has drastically reduced pollution, noise, road accidents, and a recent study of the Barcelona Institute for Global Health also says this reduces nearly 700 premature deaths per year. And this was a big transit space for cars on the highway it's being transformed at the moment into a green ecological corridor. But health and climate, they are wicked problems. We cannot solve them alone. So we need also new partnerships and alliances. This is an example of Hong Kong. one of the densest cities in the world, where developers are permitted to expand commercially viable space in a building if they create pocket parks on the site. So this renegotiation between city government and the private sector is creating more green social spaces close by for its youngest residents. And the schools becoming more a key actor in turning neighborhoods for community and also naturally adapted for climate change. This is an example in Berlin, where schools are transforming concrete schoolyards into natural and adventurous playgrounds and opening them up to the neighborhood after school hours. Kids have more bruises, but they have less serious accidents. And they learn to reconnect with nature and learn through all their senses. So it's an important partner to make this happen is the schools. In Tirana, different type of alliance. The mayor has structured his grand vision of the city for urban change around children and made them his allies. The allies of a new green agenda. And he also installed or appointed a chief child officer in the governments of his city. And this person could ensure that children are on the daily basis on the agenda, but also, and that's an easy topic to cross the discussions across sectors and break down some of the silos. This is unlocking greater well-being for young people, but it also is increasing green in the city and climate adaptation. And the vice mayor recently in the World Planning Congress told us that in fact in COVID times too, during the lockdown, these measures that have been taken during the last 3-4 years, that they were also the best measures for giving mental and green space for people during lockdown, with a lot of families and elderly coming out. In Malmo, they have a user-driven partnership between skateboarders, an NGO and public institution, and they have a skateboard coordinator in the city. You might know this example in South Africa, so strong segregation in neighborhoods. This is one of the largest and fastest growing informal settlements, where private sector, local government, urban planners and community partnered with an initiative being at the fountain. So they created multifunctional spaces around clean water points. Girls that were afraid to venture out for water before have now collective multifunctional spaces close by. They became an oasis for community life. And underused and violent areas are transformed. So the perception of fear decreased, and this enables also more young people to go out. We can also plan, adapt, and design literally with, this is an example of India where 35,000 youth were engaged from 23 cities to help redesign their neighborhoods. And an important reason is that also these young people are caregivers of their younger siblings, so they know exactly what the problems are and where the good areas are in their own streets and neighborhoods. There are also examples of, for instance, working with Minecraft, the young people in Pristina and Gaza, turning underutilized spaces around in skateboard parks and new public spaces. And this is an award-winning board game that is used in Charlotte in the US to develop together with people different scenarios. And that includes, of course, different scenarios of climate, but it makes it more accessible for people. I also worked on a project on Urban 95 where they have introduced virtual reality, so people can have an impression of what the city looks like from the perspective of a child. But this can equally be done with very low-tech mechanisms like you see here. And this is actually also important to build empathy as an empathy building tool for different sectors and political decision makers. I'd like to focus on two special projects for co-creation. So to go a step further is tactical urbanism. And this is a project in a neighborhood in Bogota. So we go to Colombia. It is a neighborhood with a high number of teenage parents and very young children, pregnant adolescents and refugees. So for the young parents living here, it's lonely and stressful because of cars, but also small violence and drug dealing. And here, tactical urbanism, co-creation with youth and caregivers was used to drive change. A child priority zone was identified, anchored around school and kindergarten. Paint, furniture, and flower pots were used to close roads and slow down traffic. This is quick, cheap, and temporary prototyping for transformation. And lessons have been learned and then integrated into both public space and social policy of the city. And they're also thinking about integrating some of the lessons and principles in national policy. So this is streets for cars turned into public spaces for people, connecting, adding green. And this is creating quality connections and much more responsive connections between young children and their parents, for instance, which they didn't have within the houses with a lot of stress. So, and that is then again important as a lifelong impact for child development. Another promising inclusive initiative is citizen science. And this is an example of Antwerp, where about 1,000 or 2,000 citizens were engaged in measuring air pollution in their street. Very low cost. It was €10 per device fixed at the houses. And they got the €10 back if they delivered the device after 3 months. And this has led to the world's largest citizen science project at that time on air pollution. And it has both given a lot of understanding and insight from residents' side. 100% have changed behaviors in terms of mobility. And it also, they entered into dialogue with the city government, and they have been compelled to first introduce short-term measures immediately, but then also has pushed a long-term project, which would be a 15-kilometer cover of a highway into a green corridor with new urban development and a 50-50 split modal share. We can also have intertwined health on a much smaller scale, which is the scale of buildings through transformative urban design. And here you see kids climbing in trees. There could be 100 at the same time. And they run about 4 kilometers before lunch instead of 500 meters in a normal average kindergarten. So it's the design of the roof and the connection with nature that enables them to do what they naturally do, which is running around in circles and climbing in trees. And so studies afterwards have also gained insight in that children are healthier, they're more creative. And also this model proved very favorable for kids with autism. So there's a very long waiting list for them to enter. And then this also has to be opened to the neighborhood. So it becomes part of a public space. And then we have another very prototype and innovative example is the farming kindergarten in Vietnam for children of low socio-income factory workers. So here they grow health and vegetables. The children learn how to reconnect with nature and with food production. And the roof enables them, and they're drawing automatically to go on the roof. So it's actually then the design enables them to easily go there. And the food is then harvested and used in the food production. And the water of the factory is recycled and is used for agriculture. This is an example, for instance, of in Copenhagen, also again, how we can rethink the public buildings and how a waste to energy power plant can also become a public space with skiing, a forest on the side, hiking paths, etc. Going to a much larger scale would be the city region. And for that, we go to China. We haven't mentioned the topic of water yet, which of course is also a key climate issue and environmental and health. Because floodings, they cause about 100 billion in damage in China. 400 of the 662 cities suffer water shortages. 70% of the nation surface water is polluted. And 50% of wetlands have been disappeared in the past 50 years with a tremendous loss of wildlife habitat. And then you know the pictures of the typical of the cities that are million cities with grey and concrete infrastructure and very little green left. So China has launched a national initiative called the Sponge City, with the aim to reuse at least 70% of rainwater in the cities by 2030. And the urban sponges are capturing, yes, I'm my final example, storing, filtering, and reusing rainwater while creating productive landscapes and urban well-being. Here you can see too that the floodings from before and the grey infrastructure, it's a spatial story, and this is the after. This is the ecological corridor in Xi'an City. And so this shows us too that these, you could call it a natural-based mega project. They can be relatively short-term because they can happen between 1 and 3 years. They are much less investment, they need much less investments than grey infrastructure. They are also low maintenance, so have lesser costs, contribute to biodiversity, nature, and urban health and well-being, and bring people again back closer to nature. And this is also connected with the community or the neighborhood level in terms of walking and cycling. So to summarize, we're dealing with a cluster of global health and climate biodiversity challenges. They're all crying for change. We can make a change to orienting our spatial and urban planning frameworks based on a couple of principles: a track which is a co-creation of long-term vision and spatial framework, a track 2 which is based on action priorities, a track 3 which gives space to stakeholder collaborations and new alliances, and a track 4 which is a continuous track, I would say, which is civil society empowerment, capacity building, learning and testing, as we have seen with citizen science and with the co-production and tactical urbanism. So to end, and if we look in the future, we could say that we ask ourselves 3 questions. How can we improve the health and well-being of people, of our environment, and does it improve our equity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Belper, for that very interesting presentation. There's a few things that I've picked up, which I think there's a lot of lessons that one can learn from. The one specific is the new partnerships between city government and the private sector. We've also always had here in South Africa as well the public-private partnerships, but I'm not sure if it's really working properly with regard to what do we want to achieve. Obviously, the private sector, they would have a certain social responsibility with regard to that, but also they would also see what is the value that they get out of those partnerships. So I think that's a very important aspect that we need to look at, and to see how do we tap into that, because I think there's a very good place there. The other one that I found very interesting is the citizen science project, because that also assist in making the community aware of what is the possibilities and the impact of what we are seeing every day. I would also, while I'm looking at one of the questions in the chat box, just ask people, if you've got a question, you're welcome to type it in the chat box, and we can then take it from there. I think the one challenge that we've got is how do we change the way of walking, and I put walking in inverted commas there, walking with your feet from walking with your fingers, because I think there's a whole change to walking with your fingers on screens rather than walking in the nature. I think the question that I've got there is how do you make sure that actually happens? So that's the one question. I also want to ask, there's a question from a M. Buerta. Planning with community is important. How effective is a board game used in Charlotte? And do you have more information about that? Elizabeth, over to you.
Yes, I'm trying to, okay, yeah. Yes, yes. The presentation on Charlottesville, I recommend you also. That is actually a case that has been presented in the recent World Planning Congress of ISOCARP. So the case study is available on the website. Yes, that the scenario, the board game has been building in different scenarios, so it allows people to imagine and discuss the different effects of of the different scenarios, and especially I think is first looking at the trend scenario. What happens when we do nothing? And I think that when we work with communities and people, that is always an important starting point. That first we see what is the effect when we don't act and we do nothing, and then what are the trade-offs? Because of course there has to be trade-offs in working with communities too. But you can find that, I think, also on the webpage from Charlottesville itself, and definitely the case study. There is also a video of that on the webpage. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Sibongile, I see your mic is muted. You want to ask a question? No, Sibongile, you want to ask a question? Okay, no, we can't hear. The other question that I've got is the example that you used with where there's a change in the city, bringing in new or maybe old or revive old open spaces. How do you address the security aspect? Because that is one thing that we've seen on advertisements within South Africa with regard to safety. Within open spaces, especially in mid-towns of cities. Any examples with regard to that?
What do you mean in terms of security, like road violence or violence, or I mean, there's different types.
No, I'm talking about security where you've moved away from having the traffic. Now you've got the pedestrians only, or the community only. But how do you then address the safety of people moving through those spaces? Because that is, I think there's some central areas where that is typically an issue.
Yes, but so more to the traffic accident wise, or?
No, safety of the people using those open spaces.
Yeah, in terms of crime, or?
Yeah. Yes, in terms of crime, yes.
Okay, yeah. Because of course, for instance, I think that's very different in different contexts. In the neighborhood in Bogota, that was an issue. And you had vacant lots used, for car parking and some drugs dealing behind it. But by engaging the people who lived there, and they turned that around, there was also much more. In fact, people didn't dare to come in the street, and bringing kids even to school was in a hurry. And that turned around into both the kindergarten, using the public space, in fact, the street space, but also much more people coming out in the street. And that's a bit the principle of eyes on the street. More people, and also to provide different uses for play, for sitting, green, etc. So that changed the whole security aspect. Yeah. And I think the important thing here is with this prototyping and tactical urbanism is that there is a link with the city. So the city is okay that the community and the neighborhood can do this and experiment. Foundation came in to invest in this, and I think that's an important role too for foundations and organizations. What can they do? They can provide these budgets that cities sometimes don't have, but they keep on being linked with the local government. So the lessons are drawn. There is a keen interest both from public space infrastructure and social divisions within the city, and that's then been integrated again into their own city policies.
Okay, thank you. I see there's a hand from Jibrin Khatun. You can proceed with your question. Jibrin, you are muted.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning. You can proceed.
Yeah. The issue of inclusive city, conceptualizing inclusive city in a traditional setting. In some countries, like in Africa, we are traditional settings. We call it organic urban setting, where large part of the city is not planned. Mm. Yes, the large part of the city is not planned. Poor infrastructure. They call it organic or informal settlement. Now, with other parts of the city, we are planned. Then, how can we conceptualize the city? How can inclusiveness be achieved in this form of city?
Thank you for that question. Elizabeth, do you want to respond?
Yes, I think so there is, for me, inclusiveness, there is two parts to it. It's having people in mind, because also it's the actual engagement of people and ensuring that the different fractions are involved, age groups, etc. But also having people in mind, civil servants, also politicians, and therefore we need to think about tools that can actually increase that thought of inclusiveness at the different levels. So the actual engagement, I think there was a couple of examples, and the tactical urbanism is also one that I have seen an example from that in Kenya being used. Also measuring air pollution with in a low-tech way, but that increased the level understanding from the people. Here, for instance, in the example shown near Cape Town, it's also working with young people, because that's where a lot of the violence was, and providing other activities. So they had a focus one on the issue of water, and how can we combine this with early childhood development activities, but also community, a space for communities where they can come together and celebrate. And the other part was, which I didn't have the time to explain, is a kind of activity hubs that were in the middle of the informal settlement. And these activity hubs were connected with each other. They were everywhere visible. So there's a lot of design measures that are included, bringing a lot of people in this spine that goes through the informal settlements. And these activity hubs were activated day and night with, for instance, homework help, what young people need, sport activities, urban agriculture, but also IT possibilities. And this has been a partnership of, yes, grassroots people who live there, and urban planners and the government and private sector who then contribute, for instance, to funding sports field, etc.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and for your presentation as well. I'm going to go over now to the next presenter. It's Dr. Nelson Chanza from the Department of Urban Regional Planning at University of Johannesburg with the topic Prospects of Twinning Climate Change and Urban Sustainable Issues through Transformative Adaptation Lessons for African Cities. I just quickly want to refer to Dr. Chanza's bio. He's a research fellow at the Department of Urban Regional Planning at University of Johannesburg. He's also a fellow of the German Academic Exchange Service DART under the CHIPMAP Africa program for climate change research. He holds a PhD in environmental geography from Nelson Mandela University. Thank you very much, Dr. Chanza. I'm giving over to you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Martin. My talk is on the prospects of twinning climate change and the urban sustainability issues through transformative adaptation. And I shall be drawing from lessons in terms of the adaptation pathways that are being pursued by African cities. To frame the problem, yes, indeed, there are twin challenges that we are facing in Africa with regards to rapid urbanization and the climate change. I think from the previous presentation, we have also noticed that these are critical emerging issues that we are captivated with. And of course, we need to do something about them. So the question that tends, of course, to occupy our attention in terms of a drive towards inclusive cities relates to how do we address these twin challenges. And this has been from understanding that we need to build a resilience against climate change. And of course, we also need to promote inclusive cities through, for example, pursuing the sustainable development goals. In particular, sustainable development goal number 11 talks about making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, and resilient and sustainable. Whereas SDG number 13 talks about taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. However, the past 3 decades of climate action, including, of course, the also over four decades of sustainability awareness and practice, have failed to usher in the anticipated inclusivity that we are anticipating, and this has also been aggravated by climate change. So with reference to climate change impacts in African cities, we notice that climate change is happening against a backdrop of underlying urban development challenges. And it tends, of course, to exacerbate these unsustainability issues. That's, of course, posing a challenge in terms of the drive towards sustainable human settlements. It's a fact that most of the African cities, if not all, are associated with the high climatic risks and deficiencies in resilience. And the reason why climate change is a particularity in the city relates, of course, to high concentrations of people and, of course, high concentration of infrastructure. So basically, this is just to show the emerging climatic risks, of course, in African cities, as you can see from this map. These tend, of course, to be mainly related to sea level rises associated with the global warming, floods, and largely, of course, affecting the coastal, most of the coastal cities. Inland cities are also not spared in terms of flash floods, some flooding which also occur in mainly in low-lying areas, and of course drought, which can also threaten water supply challenges. So in terms of the approaches now to tackle these challenges, we tend, of course, to appreciate that there is need, of course, to understand the implications of climate change. And it's necessary, of course, to try to make transitions from adaptive capacity to transformative capacity. This is what is largely emerging in scholarship to do with adaptation to climate change. So positioning cities in global climate action has received mixed attention and approaches. And most of these approaches, of course, remain varied and heterogeneous. Generally, we tend to see that the approaches tend to be weak, piecemeal, and fragmented if they are to be equated to the climatic risks that we are experiencing in most of these cities. And we can conclude that general climate change has not been fully mainstreamed in urban development initiatives. And of course, there are evident challenges with regards to the traditional adaptation pathway, which tends, of course, to concentrate on climate change as a source of vulnerability. So our thinking here is we would need, of course, to make a departure from focusing, from locating vulnerability within climate change to focus to the entire socio-ecological setup of urban cities, so that we'll be able, of course, to address the deep-rooted non-climatic drivers of vulnerability. Because the current approaches are largely focusing on adapting to climate disturbances instead of adapting with the vulnerable urban population. So as this inclusivity agenda takes shape, there is need, of course, to focus on those critical questions which relate, of course, to how adaptation plans would impact on marginalized people, especially those that are located in informal settlements. And also, questions have been raised with regards to framing resilience, to say whose resilience adaptation interventions are targeting. So the urban climate resiliency agenda should focus on addressing key questions which relate to how does the city work in terms of its entire socio-ecological system, and what are the direct and indirect impacts of climate change. We also need, of course, to understand what the climatic events and the broad climatic risks, of course, and the type of the sectors that they do affect, and who is least able, of course, to respond to the shocks and stresses that are being potentiated by climate change. So in its understanding, broadly, urban resilience is about the capacity of cities to function so that people living and working in cities, particularly the poor and vulnerable, can survive and thrive no matter what stresses or shocks they encounter. The traditional approach compared, of course, to what is proposed in the transition transformative agenda, you do notice that basically the history of climate change adaptation, the lessons which have been drawn, we have been largely focusing on protecting systems from weather and climate events. And there is now increased thoughts that we need, of course, to make sure that adaptation is targeted to the entire socio-ecological system, making sure that the approach are also proactive instead of hurried interventions associated to targeting climatic change as a source of vulnerability. We also need to integrate internal processes within the entire urban socio-ecological system. Then, of course, there are gains associated with this proposed approach, because it will be a driver towards sustainable pathway. The traditional approaches generally have been missing on opportunities, especially those that would arise when climatic risks are jointly treated with environmental sustainability. So adaptation planning, of course, would need to embrace justice-sensitive approaches to address existing vulnerabilities and to avoid maladaptive and conflicting outcomes. This is what is emerging largely from literature. Transformative adaptation, of course, will be considered essential to enable system change rather than relying on incremental adaptation that falls short of providing the desired sustainable development trajectories, because it moves from merely responding to challenges to shaping those challenges together with the affected vulnerable sections of the city. The aim, of course, is to extend the benefits and synergies with other broad urban development goals. Obviously, it's intended to deal with the severe climatic risks and the vulnerability across the entire socio-ecological system. This is just to show what other cities have been doing and the emerging climate risks. That's drawing from Durban in South Africa and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Durban has been an early adapter to climate change, especially in Africa. And they have actually identified some specific climatic threats which are related, of course, to sea level rise, storm surges, flooding, extreme precipitation, and of course, a warming trend. So in terms of intervention there, as you can see, a sizable number of the urbanized are still in informal settlements, and about 32% live in poverty. Unemployment is around 39%, and the gap between the rich and the poor is high. And its economic contribution, of course, GDP contribution to the economy of South Africa is also quite significant, at around 9%. So this is a clear invitation, of course, for urgent action in terms of both the hard and soft approaches, of course, to adaptation. So there have been a number of proposals and activities which are happening around there in terms of ecosystem restoration, maintenance, and some structural interventions. The main issue here is to make sure that these interventions should reflect on the interests or the extent to which they are also incorporating, especially the urban informal settlements and the poor. Otherwise, the interventions may not be inclusive or may not be sustainable. Tanzania, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania also experienced similar climatic threats, including more or less the same with what is experienced in Durban, including, of course, a drying trade, which also exerts some pressure in terms of water supply challenges. But in terms of urban unsustainability threats, you do notice that about 25%, only about 25% have access to potable water, and about 75% in informal and safe settlements, where urban sprawl and expanding informal settlements are typical and sustainability issues there. So we need, of course, joint treatment in terms of looking at how best would we make these interventions so that they go beyond climatic to also include the sustainability interests. Therefore, we are proposing that transformative adaptation could be a promising approach in making this inclusive agenda realizable, because the purpose of adaptation obviously is to build adaptive capacity or to make communities resilient against climatic disturbances. Therefore, strong adaptation interventions are required to build resilient urban communities. But the history of adaptation practice has shown that adaptation responses have largely failed to address deep-rooted urban development issues that hinder transitions towards resilient and sustainable cities. So the focus here is now on transformative adaptation. But of course, this is not without challenges in an African setting. For example, it may be difficult. Emerging lessons are showing that it's not going to be easy and easier walk in the park. Why? Because we still have growing uncertainties about climate change risks, and the adaptation benefits probably are not adequately understood, meaning to say the issue of climate awareness, climate education, mainstreaming climate change intervention in the urban development programs is very, very important. With regards to experiences with Cyclone Idai in Zimbabwe, for example, in Chimanimani, we have learned that previously known risks tended to be low. The information or the knowledge about what mountainous towns and the climate risks they can experience has not been largely understood. And as a result, this was more like a new lesson emerging that we needed to do something with regards to embracing climate change in the urban development intervention in general, because concentration has largely been on the large cities and low-lying other urban centers. There is also the high cost of transformative action. The key question that we also needed to focus on is, cities in low-income countries in Africa ready for these transformative actions with regards to the cost implications of doing that? We have also noticed that institutional and behavioral actions that tend to maintain the status quo, there is the desire to maintain status quo, also climate change denialists, or those that acknowledge its existence, but don't have the capacity to do something about it. So those are emerging challenges that will tend, of course, to affect this transition. So the key lessons that are emerging from this, if adaptation practices are hastily executed, they are likely to miss on opportunities to address underlying non-climatic drivers of vulnerability. Of course, this will lead to sustainable development failures, and the traditional adaptation approaches have failed to match, or are failing actually to match, the severity of climate change impacts, those which are being experienced and those which are anticipated in a growing, warming climate environment. Cities embracing a transformative adaptation approach are better prepared to tackle growing climate risks. And the transformative paradigm is inclusive because it can address the entire urban and sustainability issues beyond climatic impacts. Right on time, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I end here.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you very much also for staying within time. With regard to the registration, I've seen that there was a link posted in the chat box for registration. To list your registration, that is also required for SAC Plan CPD points that you would be able to claim for attending this symposium. If there's any questions that you would like to ask, please post that on the chat or raise your hand, and then we can address that. Thank you again. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, and for making us think as well. I've got one or two questions that I just want to highlight or ask. And I've seen one of the slides you indicate that we should move towards a proactive response. So my question from your research, which successes have you seen where there was a move from a reactive to a proactive response, and how did the change happen? If you've picked up anything like that during your research.
Thank you, Martin. I would acknowledge that the transformative agenda is still an emerging notion. In its history of deployment, it is about 10, 12 years old, and we haven't seen much in terms of success stories, especially in Africa, though there is now growing appetite based on the lessons which have been drawn from the traditional approach. That if we are to focus on locating vulnerability from the climate change impacts itself, without broadening our approach to the entire urban socio-ecological system, we are likely to miss out on opportunities. So I think of late we are beginning to see some growing acknowledgement in terms of embracing this thought. And the Durban example, which I have cited, I think it could be still a bit early, maybe to talk about success stories, but indicators are there that if we are to broaden our focus to address other deep-rooted urban and sustainability issues beyond climatic, then there will be added advantages around that. I think we have seen some emerging or promising lessons, largely in European cities like Copenhagen, in terms of focusing on the other, the integration of other urban issues, for example, in terms of transportation, whereby maybe the shift is now also in terms of sustainable or clean transportation systems, which is also embraced largely by the citizens. Yeah, but so generally, I think promising lessons are there, though it's still a learning exercise.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Are there any further questions for Dr. Chonza at this moment in time before we move over to the next speaker? I don't see any questions in the chat box, and I don't see any hands. So I'm going to go over to the next presenter. The next presenter is Mr. Pravin Akia.
Sorry, Martin.
Yes.
Yes, apologies. I can't see the icon where I could raise my hand. But my comment is with regard to the broader approach which Nelson is directing us to do, to then challenge him in, say, the rapid urbanization, because the cities are meant to be urbanizing because they are meant to be productive in nature. So urbanization is not a challenge, but how a city is being managed, maybe it's what we need to also focus and also look at the details of how we can know on who is coming in the city and their land use activities, which will then assist in drafting a better strategy towards mitigating or adaptation that we are currently trying to achieve. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Zaki, for that. Nelson?
Yes, precisely. I think what we need to learn about the urbanization trajectory that is emerging in Africa is this should be an opportunity for us to say, as the cities are urbanizing rapidly, let's do it in a way that is comprehensive, so that we are also ready, of course, to face the challenges that come with the rapid urbanization. So emerging lessons from Africa indicating that urbanization, most of the cities or our authorities are not fully ready to address the challenge that come with rapid urbanization. And this tends now to be exacerbated by climate change. So if we are to comprehensively look at urban rapid urbanization, and how do we do maybe with regards to water provision? Because, for example, we are urbanizing rapidly, but our water resources, for example, are being constrained. So how should we make sure that rapid urbanization is also to address maybe water supply challenges that we're experiencing, say, in Port Elizabeth, say in Cape Town, say in Bulawayo, say in Dar es Salaam. So yes, we need a comprehensive approach to attend to these emerging challenges of urbanization and climate change.
Thank you. Any other questions before we move on? No, doesn't seem like that. Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to go over to Mr. Pravin Akia, who is from a Senior Manager, Integrated Development Planning from eThekwini Municipality. His topic is roles of people-centered public spaces in achieving healthy and clean environment within the context of inclusive cities. I just want to highlight some of the things from Mr. Akia's bio. He's a professional planner with more than 20 years of experience in various parts of the globe. Current duties include the preparation of development of the City of Durban Integrated Development Plan and the eThekwini Municipality 1 Plan. He's also the technical chair of the United Cities for Local Government, Urban Strategic Planning Committee, and a member of the Sustainable Cities Committee of the Commonwealth Local Government Associations. He's also currently a SAC Plan Council member. Mr. Akia, when you're ready, you can proceed.
Thank you, Martin. Just before I go ahead, can you hear me, and are you able to see the slide?
We can hear you clearly, and we can see the slide. Thank you.
Brilliant. Good morning, colleagues, and to the presenters before me. Thank you so much for the amazing content. And to the presenters that are coming after me, I hope I do not steal any of your content, but hopefully that I'll be able to add as well as emphasize some of the key components relating to inclusive cities, but also resilient cities. But I make my comments specifically looking towards public space. And in terms of the presentation done by Elizabeth, I see this as more of an amplification of the content that was actually presented earlier itself. So I think before we go ahead, I think, we got to understand and we got to note that, in terms of COVID-19, it's really made us rediscover the actual value statement or the value of public space in terms of the key aspects of well-being, as well as citizen healthiness, as well as urban development. And we also need to start rethinking how we look at our urban spaces to become or to create more inclusive, resilient, democratic, sustainable, and healthy metropolitan spaces itself. Majority of the world's population undeniably actually live in metropolitan areas, and access to public space is key factor for building resilience, but also inclusivity as well. But it's amazing that whilst we look at public space as being one of those key enablers, many citizens actually do not view public space as a key city infrastructure. And it is often overlooked in building resilience as well as creating inclusive cities itself. How cities or how citizens consume public space is very different across the world, from the likes of Kibera in Kenya, Durban from where we are, and how people view spaces differently. Let's just say in the likes of New York. In New York, public space is often translated to a park or a plaza. In Durban, if you look at parts of Durban, example Warwick, the streets are truly the public spaces, and the people out there daily are either selling, trading, using the space. It's really about people making their living. They live their lives right out on the streets. So having safe and adequate public spaces for activity is just as vital as having areas in terms of service for water and electricity as well. Now, not everything can be solved at the local level. We do need all levels of governance to actually come together to deliver effective spaces itself. But starting at a city level gives us a transformative element towards inclusive and resilient cities itself. We have to get people to understand that when we are planning for cities, we need to look at multi-sectorial approaches. If we approach planning with a singular focus and we try to sort out only one challenge, either access to electricity, access to water, access to housing, and so forth, it actually only provides a temporary solution or a solution in the short term. We've got to understand that short-termism thinking is the enemy of resilience and inclusivity at cities itself. The question is, how do we use resources and assets? And I stress the word assets, like people-centered public space, to assist in building resilient as well as inclusive cities. Okay. The most effective solutions are often the one that is inexpensive and tangible. And by increasing physical activities such as walking, cycling, and so forth, we start to build resilient and inclusive cities, but we also start to improve social cohesion in terms of citizen participation as well. Well-managed and maintained public spaces at a community level can deliver the same impact that regional public spaces offer, like your Durban Promenade itself. Therefore, access to public spaces across a scale of urban dimensions are critical to building resilience and inclusive cities itself. Public spaces have the potential to deliver sustainable food security as well as sustainable livelihood opportunities. We cannot talk about inclusive cities as well as resilient cities without securing access to good quality, nutritious foods across all economic groups across the city itself. Globally, there's a shift towards community, schools, as well as roof gardens as further opportunities to expand the food security delivery mechanisms. A few years ago, the city successfully converted the City Hall garden to a veg garden, and the produce was donated to Tafta Homes itself. Opportunities such as community gardens supplying soup kitchens at schools should also be promoted and encouraged itself. The above picture is an example of the Ilangeni Gardens, which actually supplies fresh produce to hotels and businesses around the Durban CBD itself. A resilient city, an inclusive city, is a city that actually looks at inclusive design, but also a city that actually builds social capital itself. The process of creating strong public spaces for vibrant and resilient neighborhoods often offers residents of developing world cities a unique opportunities not only to build stronger and more permanent physical settlements, but also to build far more robust civic social networks as well. Placemaking can serve as a bridge linking the resources of the formal city and the open culture of the informal city, enriching both sides of life and assist in building inclusivity itself. The above picture is from Dandora, Kenya, where UN Habitat actually looked at building or designing parks using Minecraft. It's similar to the example that Elizabeth shared earlier on. And the city of Joburg is also looking at these opportunities in terms of design as well. How we use the impact of the pandemic to actually deliver on better planned and better designed open spaces. We'll also look at how we address inclusivity from a social, environment, and economic perspective. Many cities and municipalities have not moved away from the concept of local government to local governance. We need to understand that there is a huge difference between local government and governance. Local governance claims responsibility for all city stakeholders in planning, management, and the governance of urban centers itself. For resilient, inclusive, and people-centered public space, we need local government governance mindset and not a local government administrative mindset. We need to look at where cities can actually give back spaces to empower our citizens itself. Cities such as Brussels, which actually used to be car-orientated, are transforming their urban form to actually give back space to people and provide better access to public and green spaces for walking, places to meet, places to go out, thus improving the air quality, but also spaces for exercise as well. Many cities have actively been involved in working at community levels to assist in developing solutions to address resilience and inclusivity itself. To be able to achieve inclusive, resilient public spaces, we have to, through the acceptance of the new urban agenda as well as the SDGs, cities have acknowledged the need to develop partnership arrangements and agreements that allow for various stakeholders, including private sectors, NGOs, youth groups, women groups, and academia, to participate as equal partners with government in shaping a cleaner, safer, and more inclusive city itself. But we actually need to decide as to how do we bridge the gap between private and public spaces, ensure that we ensure that we have equal access to public spaces itself. The fundamental shift is really taking place in terms of sustainable human settlements to sustainable urban development agenda itself. With that has to come a shift in terms of how cities are built. And it talks to the point that Martin mentioned earlier on, is how do we move away from the city at a eye level in terms of a skyline to a eye level that actually talks effectively to walking and traveling at a city level. How do cities optimize public spaces to ensure that we have access to natural environment and adequate space for opportunities for physical environment as well? We need to ensure that we optimize the use of both public spaces as well as semi-private spaces itself for safe use, but also to improve mental health, which is a key component of resilient and safe cities itself. However, critical for me is how do we as cities begin to build confidence in our administration to support the development of people-centered public spaces that are often perceived to be unsafe from our residents' perspective. So whether it's the current pandemic in terms of health and environmental safety, or from a safety aspect in terms of crime, how do we build confidence in our residents to actually return to public space? And that's a critical challenge that we need to follow through. We need to also look at continued and increased capital investment in public space. Many cities are experiencing the current challenge where funds for public space have been redressed or reduced or reviewed or realigned to finance other developments in the cities itself. Cities need to capitalize on the implementation of public space. The example of Bogota, where 1% of public space generates $1 million in revenue in dense urban areas, is an indication of the value or the revenue that could potentially be generated from public space itself. However, in saying that, whilst we capitalize on open space and the requisite funding needs to flow to maintain and develop inclusive public spaces at all levels of the government itself. Now, I thought it would be a good place within the presentation to actually talk to some of the work that we've done at UCLG in terms of developing the concept of the public space dividend to ensure that we create a sort of cogent argument across local municipalities when dealing or when engaging with the likes of funders, whether it be the city or whether it be other stakeholders, in terms of what are the possible benefits of that investment in public spaces itself. So whilst we implement public space, we could also have social benefits, economic benefits, as well as environmental benefits. And the more of these benefits we actually address, the greater the dividend in terms of the investment itself. So it starts to create an economic argument for a social development that is actually quite critical in terms of city development itself. So we do know that many cities have, countries as well as cities have acknowledged the need to actually implement the new urban agenda as well as the SDGs in terms of building resilient cities and inclusive cities. SDG 11.7 talks directly to the likes of inclusive cities itself. The new urban agenda as well as the SDGs provides that framework to achieve resilience and inclusivity. However, cities need to localize these frameworks to realize the intent of the objectives of these global goals itself. The slide above is just an illustration of how public space is interrelated and key to achieving the other SDGs and the indicators as well. Now, in terms of public space, local governments actually play very different roles, be it funder, regulator, facilitator, or implementer as well. We need to be careful in terms of the role that we play and how we actually build inclusive cities and resilient cities, that we should not actually exclude any citizens in terms of the actual development process itself. One clear example is that we're finding globally the operation and maintenance of public spaces are actually being given to private companies and thereby actually creating exclusive spaces and not understanding the sort of intent of why public space is actually there. It is actually for the use of public good. But by privatizing the operation of public spaces, we're actually creating exclusive places itself. So what are some of the key messages? Is that we need to continue investing in people-centered public space. We need to ensure that we have inclusive and equitable access to public space across all demographic profiles itself. We need to look at alternative funding models for public space without, and I compromise this, without compromising access and inclusivity. Possible PPPs could be looked at. To develop and maintain a healthy, resilient citizenry, the city needs to look towards people-centered public space itself. But many cities actually fall into the trap of actually developing pockets of excellence. However, that pockets of excellence need to be expanded into a complete system of public space itself. And city strategy starts to play an important role in this aspect itself. With every opportunity, or with every challenge comes opportunities. The question for us is, as public space advocates is how do we use this opportunity to actually improve and enhance our public space, and therefore promoting resilience and inclusive cities itself. There is no better time for cities to look at public space as being the catalyst to build resilience, but more so, public space becoming beacons of hope itself. My final words is, as cities, we often appreciate the voices of support, and we should also equally embrace the voices of disagreement and allow our citizens to express themselves in a responsible and appropriate manner, as this too is being part of an inclusive and resilient cities itself. So Chairperson, thank you so much for the opportunity. Glad to take any questions, comments, or concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Akia, for that very interesting presentation. Yes, I think the one thing that you've mentioned, and we've seen it throughout, is the importance of public spaces, specifically with COVID, and the spaces that we need for exercise, especially within cities where we are living within high-rise buildings sometimes across Europe, where that's the only place that you've got, and the city has been developed for you to actually use the public spaces. And if we are limited to a residential unit, the importance of such exercise and such public spaces become just so much more important. The other point that I would like to highlight, what you've said, is that public spaces is not only parks, it's not only green areas, it is also the streets. So we should look at that in a holistic manner. I'm going to ask if you can maybe share your slides so that I can see if there's any hands or any person that would like to ask a question. If you don't find the hand button, just unmute and say who you are, and then you can ask your questions. Any questions for Mr. Akia? Yes.
Martin?
Yes, please proceed.
Yes, so thank you for the presentation. I have a question with regard to that we have to start creating an economic argument. I think that that's completely correct, because we have to find different ways in translating the health benefits, well-being, etc., into, especially to convince policymakers and looking at investments. I mean, we know that local governments have limited budgets, especially with COVID. A lot of the budget went into different domains. There was recently also a survey of, I think, 800 cities, and the majority said we don't even have money for climate adaptation, but not even to plan for climate. So bringing sectors together, sometimes they have overlapping budgets, so to actually create synergies, but also creating translate the benefit into what it costs in financial terms. Do you have examples of that? Because so far I don't see much of this yet, if we look around in cities and in the world.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Martin. I think Elizabeth, brilliant question. We developed this framework in 2016, leading towards the UN Habitat 3, as well as the adoption of the New Urban Agenda, where we actually found that many cities were finding it difficult to quantify the need for investment into public space itself. So we created this concept, and it was actually developed by myself in terms of a dividend using an economic model itself. Now, the best possible sort of example is actually coming out of Bogota in terms of investment in public space and the actual financial revenue benefit in terms of revenue from rates, services, and taxes, and so forth. So some of that data can be shared itself. But in saying that, so whilst we actually invest in public space and actually see the benefits at a social, economic, as well as environmental basis itself, we can also expand that in terms of, should we actually invest in public space, we actually start to see the benefits in terms of a resilience dividend as well, in terms of what we are achieving or what we hope to achieve from a resilience perspective. So we got to understand that the sort of monitoring mechanisms and performance mechanisms for this is actually around the impacts, which actually take a longer term to actually quantify. But in terms of the short term, I think, you know, your revenue base or your revenue generated from rate, service, and taxes based on property value could be one of the easiest or the quickest way of extracting the sort of dividend or the support of a dividend itself. Thank you.
Can I just add here, because it's an interesting thing, the property value. I mean, I had that experience with working on these projects in Ghent, for instance. What often happens is there is a lot of talk about, yes, the value of property goes up, but at the same time, that means it's gentrification. So the original inhabitants are often pushed to other areas of the city. And so there is a new inequity. You invest in public space, maybe in a deprived neighborhood, but by doing this, the property values goes up, and so it displaces the people to another area.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I think that's critical, but I think from a city perspective is how you actually look at developing public space across all dimensions, and in the urban scale is quite important as well. So you would find that majority of the public space developments happen in urban areas, inner city urban areas, and so forth. But it's also translation of that into all areas, as I said, the urban spatial dimensions I referred to in my presentation. So the point is clearly noted, but I think how do we bring that back to all levels of community? I think is very, very critical in the discussion.
Thank you very much. I see there's a question in the chat box from Gareth. How can you get buy-in from surrounding communities in high-density urban areas to want to maintain the public space provided for them, as often the funding to maintain these public spaces doesn't materialize and the space becomes overgrown or derelict?
Yeah. Good question, Martin. I think, you know, you need to look at why the spaces actually become derelict itself. If you look at an inclusive cities approach and an inclusive design approach, and if you actually include the communities or the target communities right up front in the design and as well as the implementation, you should not actually experience this challenge. So therefore, a lot of the challenges that we experience, if we involve communities and public as well as the stakeholders up front in terms of the design, the implementation, the operations, and the management, we will not fall into this challenge itself. In saying that, I also included that maybe if we look at PPEs as an opportunity to address these current challenges that we experience, we need to ensure that the rules of engagement do not make those spaces exclusive itself. So I see there's also another question as well, and I'll try to address it in my response as well. Is public space and private space is very, very different. In the case that, listen, whilst it may be open and it may have the sort of indications that it is a private or it is a public space, or the usable public space itself. The moment it actually denies access to any member of the public, it is not deemed public space. It is deemed to be a private space. If it excludes any component of the community to actually actively engage, then it is not public space itself. So therefore, even through the design, the operation, as well as the maintenance of public spaces itself, if through any of those processes we've actually excluded public, then it is not a true reflection of a people-centered public space itself. Hopefully I've answered both Idris as well as the other question earlier on in terms of dereliction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see there's a hand from Bikani. I think we can take that one as well. Bikani, you can unmute and then ask your question.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Martin, and thanks to a colleague for a good presentation. Well, my first question was also going to be on the definition of public spaces. Well, thank you to the presenter for clarifying that. Yeah, the presentation is good. It's giving us an indication, or rather a guidance in terms of the usefulness and the value of public spaces in cities. I'm thinking of a case like the city of Durban, a rapidly urbanizing city, a city with high demand of land for housing, a city with high demand of land for food security and also other basic services. And I would like to know the possibility of such a city to give away land for public spaces. A city with so much demand, you know, of basic services, the possibility of it, you know, giving spaces for such land use or for public spaces. Thank you.
Yo, that's a tough question, but I think we need to draw the line as to what is open space, what is natural space, and what is actually usable public space itself. I think the SDGs, they talk about 30% of your city should actually be open space or active public space itself. I think it's a careful balancing act that we need to look at, because we need to ensure that there's a particular percentage of natural open spaces that we actually secure and protect as part of our overall climate mitigation and adaptation responsibility. But I also think that from a public space perspective, we also need to ensure that there is usability of that public space itself. And it comes back to the earlier sort of question is, you know, a lot of our public spaces are derelict and so forth. We need to look at the operation of those public spaces. We need to look at the usability of those public spaces and ensure that the spaces that we do have actually meet the community needs in terms of the use or the extraction of use for public enjoyment, public health, public wellness, by using public space itself. So first of all, we probably need to go back and we need to evaluate all of our public spaces in the municipality, look at which are the ones that work, which are the ones that don't work. If they don't work, why don't they work? What are some of the implication measures or implementation measures that we need to look at? Engage with those communities and actually investigate how best to take those public spaces and make them usable public spaces itself. Through those processes, we might find that, listen, we can rationalize some of those public spaces. Okay, if there's a potential for that to happen, so be it. However, we cannot just take the decision to rationalize that public space without actively engaging and looking at possible mechanism to make it fully functional. I think that is where the sort of direction we should be moving towards. So every space has the potential to be a people-centered public space itself. It's how do we extract that value for both the citizens as well as the city in terms of developing people-centered as well as an effective public space itself. I hope I answered your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gwen, for that. Elizabeth, I see you've got your hand up. I'm just looking at the time. Is it a quick question, or can we move on to the next presenter?
I just wanted to add, because it's an interesting topic, I just wanted to add just a reflection, because
yeah, please do.
Yes, with regards to the maintenance, I've also seen that there's increasingly thought and in fact testing of new practices where the Department of Maintenance, which is usually very different than the ones who envision or design the public space, or engaged in the process from the start also. So you get different ways of maintaining the public space. And an example here in Geneva, for instance, it's a very new neighborhood where a farmer can use a public piece of land for farming, so he doesn't own it. It's more in the sense of how can we use land, and then in return he will maintain the whole public space of a 3,000 persons neighborhood. And I also see with the division between private and public, you have public spaces that are privatized. We've seen it in COVID too with restaurants, they go into the streets, so they take space, but also the opposite, private space that can be made public. And again, an example in Switzerland is is embedded in zoning regulations, for instance, whereby the space around the building from, let's say, 1,000 square meters has to be for public use. The residents are involved in the design of it, and it has to remain green. So it has also a climate condition to it. And I think these are new ways and new models of also looking at it and moving forward to the use of public space and also addressing the different issues.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much, colleagues. I'm now going to give over to my co-chair, Ms. Zaki Mkhize. Zaki, you can take over as chair and then introduce the next two speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. In introducing the next speaker, his name is Jarendra Kumar, an architect. And he's going to be taking us on a presentation under a topic that planning for community and inclusiveness. And his biography, or his short bio, is read as follows. Jarendra Kumar is a practicing architect based in New Delhi, India, and the director of architects, Noida International University, Great Noida. He was recently awarded a Global Education Influencer in 2020 and an India Young Achievers Award in 2009. He graduated from Kadigar College of Architects, India, and postgraduate at Politecnico di Malino, Italy. He is a member of an ISOCAP for Netherlands, Council of Tally Building, a member of Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, USA, received fellowship by Congress of New Urbanism in USA. He delivered lectures on many national and international forums on various issues related to city, social issues, sustainable environment, and so on. In Malaysia, Russia, Korea, and USA, Taiwan, Poland, and other states, including Columbia and University, New York, Kadak, and so many others, his interests are environmentally sensitive architect and sustainable urbanism. His articles are published in newspapers, magazines in India, Italy, Spain, Russia. He is actively involved in academics. He has been a jury member of many competitions. He traveled extensively in many parts of the globe and keen photographer. His works have been exhibited in many exhibitions and events in India and along the globe. Welcome, Mr. Kumar. Can you please take us through?
Thank you so much, my colleague, and I'm really very sorry that from last 2 hours I'm struggling for electric failure. My electric power has gone, and if in between my connection get disconnected, please bear with me. I mean, from last 2 hours I'm facing a very, very tough time with my electricity in my building. Okay, so thank you so much for introduction. Thank you so much for all team for putting up such a great show. Today I'm going to be very brief. My previous speaker has spoken a very thoughtful discussion. So I'm talking about planning for community and inclusiveness. Okay, as I was introduced, I'm an architect and urbanist. I'm director of the School of Architecture, Noida International University in India. So when I'm talking, I'm basically talking about community, and in community, we basically means everyone counts. We cannot take a responsibility of, we cannot take a responsibility on only one person or one institution. We all become together. We all come together for solving any of the issues. That's what community is. I mean, that's what the responsibility of community is. So we have highlighted some of the issues which is very important when we talk about the community. We talk about engagement. We talk also about policy development and services planning. Community social planning, because please all understand that in the community planning, it is very, very important to also consideration of social. Project planning we also do a corporate and business planning. We mainly consider about community, and we also do a business development. Okay, so I will a little bit divert my talk for five more minutes on the very relevant issues of COVID in present time, what is happening. This lockdown term, which was not very familiar terms in, let's say, a year back for all the cities, but after this COVID, the lockdown has become a very important or very so much buzzword in these days. I mean, everybody is familiar with lockdown. India has also seen a series of lockdown, the phases of lockdown and unlock. My point when I'm talking about community planning, why I'm bringing the aspect of lockdown and cities in COVID. When the lockdown started, it was basically to give the message that stay at home. But what about those people who had a street as their home? I'm talking about urban poor. So India has seen the migration of these urban poor, these workforce, these labor class, just next day after the lockdown announced in India. So what does this message comes from? The message is basically that, is the city only for rich people? The moment when the lockdown happened, or the moment when the city is closed for certain days, does these urban poor have no shelter to live? So can our community cannot engage with them? So that was the very big challenge what our cities are going to face. And I'm very sure that post-pandemic, this debate about engaging of urban poor or workforce or labor class or whatever you name it, they are actually the runner for our cities. Without them, the city cannot run. And one day lockdown, it became so shocked. You might have heard in the news, after the lockdown, people walked for 1,000 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers, day and night, river, track, everywhere. They walked 1,000 kilometers every day. Walked, I repeat, walked, because the whole city was closed. Day and night they walked. This became a very big news after this girl of 15-year-old. She cycled her father for 1200 kilometers, she cycled her father. So these are the condition of our city. The moment when we went for lockdown, when the cities was opening up, then the second wave again happened. Here again, in the first phase of lockdown, the community were not together. That was also one of the big problem about this urban migration. But the reason for the second wave in COVID wave in India, it was because everybody were together. Please understand that when I'm saying everybody were together for the reason for the second wave of COVID, and the second wave of COVID was more dangerous compared to a first COVID. I'll tell you how. Here, there are political rallies happen. In between December to January and February time, when the second wave came in March and April, here 100,000 people were dipping in the river every day. 100,000 people were dipping in the river every day. Just imagine the political rallies of 500,000 people in certain regions and all those things. That was also here. All people came together. So the crowd became the problem of making the second pandemic, the second wave of pandemic. Here we talk about the second wave of pandemic came up with this shortage of oxygen. So again, when we talk about community angle, please understand, you have to be alive to be part of community. And here you can see how the shortage of oxygen happened in the hospital. Two people sleeping together in the bed because there was no bed in the hospitals. Here you can see these are the queue of dead bodies for cremation. These are the queues of dead body for the cremation. That was the extremities of the second wave of COVID pandemic happened. Here, this cremation, days and days and days went on for a cremations in Delhi. Here, the car park were converted into cremation ground. Okay, then coming back again, here I'll try to conclude this part of my talk about. So this pandemic happened in Delhi, the whole world became a small community, and whole world helped India. Here, the plane were, the oxygen were flown by plane from Italy, from Germany and all. And I really appreciate the effort of global community for a city, for Indian city of Delhi. And that gives a message of ray of hope that is still there, is a good future. There is a light at the end of tunnel. This is iconic photograph, and it takes my heart out when we see this photograph of cremation. Okay, this is another point. Here the dead bodies were floating in the river. These are dead bodies. And here the community came together. Here this person who is doing the cremation of person, he doesn't know whether this person belonged to this community or that community, this religion or that religion. They just helped. They were a professional community. So before when we talk about, okay, this is again, so here if we have to fight COVID, we all have to come together. But again, with the together, please make a togetherness, don't make a crowd. So that is one message of COVID I want to give. Okay, so what next? What next we as an architect, we as a planner can do in post-COVID pandemic cities? Hybrid working is going to be a place where, because with the COVID pandemic, the health has become an important consideration to think about. So now this psychological and neurological relaxation is also very, very important. It's going to be important in post-COVID pandemic. So the work and office or hybrid, work, home, work, school, home, office, hotel, home. So that hybrid culture is going to come in future. So what is the requirement for healthy and inclusive community model? We need to have a certain parameters. Then we cannot have, the community should not become crowd and community should not become individual. So that is where we draw the scale of line. and we are talking of a smart cities. What makes cities smart? The city is, if educated, if data means technological, if the energy is there, if the IoT, the technology. So the technology health plays very important role in making of a smart cities. The livability index, Bhutan is the only city, Bhutan is one of the country where the richness, Bhutan country I'm talking about, Bhutan country is one of the country where the richness of a particular cities or particular region, not depending on how much, what is the capital value, what city has. It also depends what is the happiness index. I believe that livability index is very, very important. There are certain countries in the world, like Scandinavian country, Norway, Sweden, Finland, these countries where this livability index is very common, although this is common in theoretical part of among the urban planner, but I think this need to be in practice. The livability index, certain forces, infrastructure, low cost, which makes the city more livable. We should, it's okay, good to talk about a smart city and all, but livable city is the new mantra which we should come. The sustainability development goal is a very, very important step, which is going to make the change, bring the change in the world. But I would really emphasize on, related with my topic about SDG 10 and SDG 11. SDG 10, which talks about reduced inequalities, and SDG 11, which talks about sustainable cities and communities. I believe these things are very important. Reduce inequalities where, the city should be inclusive for everyone. I mean, okay, look, when we talk about internet and internet becoming the new mantra for education or for the global connect, but here internet we connect together. Okay, me, I'm educated, I'm university professor, I can be connected. But what happened about those people who does not have even internet connectivity in their religious, in their religion, in their regions, or in their economical reach and all. So these are some of the things where the inequality should be reduced, not only on global level or city level. It should be also reduced on every level. Here we are talking about a societal level. Basic minimum requirements should be given to everyone. I mean, as internet, I have taken one small example, but definitely the food, education, the health, these are the things, the basic requirement we should be equal for on. Sustainable cities and communities. Yes, the cities should be sustainable. I can speak whole day about sustainable aspect, but here we are talking about community, because of one big building, which is very, very fancy building, if it is creating issues for the second building in neighbor, I believe here is the issue. So the city should be sustainable, and it should have the essence of community. Okay, so these are the reducing, some of the aspect of reduced inequalities, and as per UN SDG 10, reducing the equality. Again, here we talk about equal health, education, and food, and livable index equal for all. Again, I know because we are running short of time. The SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. Again, here our buildings plays very important role. Our infrastructure plays very important role. I believe that we should have an approach toward a sustainable aspect of any development. When I'm talking about any development, I'm talking about even making one small pen also. That is, if it is made of plastic, it is not a sustainable element. I believe that we need to respect the nature. If you don't respect the nature, it will throw you back a bigger pandemic than what COVID is today. Thank you so much. This is all from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kumar, for a lovely presentation. If I can get input from the colleagues by raise of hand. If you do not have that button, you can just raise it.
Is there any question for me?
Mr. Kumar, I don't see any hands that have indicated that there's question. Maybe you can move on to the next presenter. We will take the question if they come late, but for now, I don't see any hands. Moving to the next speaker. It is giving me a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Joe.
Oh, sorry, Zake, you are muted.
Colleagues, it's giving me a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Joe Dowell. We call her Joe in the institution that we work with. Let me take you through to her short biography. Her name is Joel Dowell. She works at the eThekwini Municipality in the Environmental Planning and Climate Protection Department. Her work has a broad focus on urban resilient and sustainable, and involves identifying strategic gaps in these spaces and then work across municipal sectors and external stakeholders to explore innovative and collaborative mechanisms to address them, to ensure a more sustainable development path for the city. Today, she'll be taking us through to expanding riverine management for sustainable, inclusive, and climate change smart cities. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks so much, Zaki, and good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, as the chair introduced, I'm going to be speaking about some work that eThekwini Municipality has been leading around thinking about this idea of transformative riverine management and how we use, or how we might better use, our rivers as spaces to build more inclusive, sustainable, and climate smart cities. So just firstly, to provide a little bit of context, our cities, as we know and as we've heard this morning and this afternoon, face multiple challenges. We face challenges of rising inequality and unemployment, declining levels of skills among our population, environmental degradation, and climate change. And so in a context which many of our municipalities face, which is one of very scarce resources, it's very important that when we think about how we intervene in spaces within our cities, that we think about how we structure interventions that can address multiple issues simultaneously. So we want biggest bang for buck. I wanted also to touch on this concept of transformation, and it's come up earlier, and I think some of what I'm going to say links to what Nelson shared earlier. But in this context of huge challenge that cities are facing, there are growing calls for transformative change, not only transformative adaptation, which Nelson spoke about earlier, but broader transformation to shift our cities onto more sustainable development trajectories. And it's important when we talk about transformation to be clear on what we mean, because often that term is used fairly loosely, because transformation is about looking at challenging the structural causes of risk that lie within and are reproduced by dominant development practices and pathways. And so examples of structural causes of risk, something like inequality is a structural cause of risk. As Nelson was saying earlier, there are these underlying things that perpetuate certain issues. Environmental degradation is another example of a structural cause of risk. And so transformation seeks to turn these things on their head and say, how do we get to those underlying things that help us to fundamentally change the systems and the cities in which we work? And so when we talk about transformation, we are talking about doing something that will result in a change in the fundamental attributes of a system. So we're talking about a complete altering, not just tweaking. We're talking about working across scales and upscaling. And importantly, we're talking about about work that should result in outcomes that are sustainable and inclusive and that should promote equality and participation. So it's very important when we hear about work that's transformative to kind of have these almost like a checklist in one's head, because otherwise we run the risk of actually perpetuating some of the issues that we're trying to address. When we talk about transformation, we're talking about different forms of governance and decision making, and if necessary, challenging those where they need to be challenged. The other part of the context to the story, which I'm going to share, is one focused on ecosystems. And there's increasing recognition of the role that our natural ecosystems play in underpinning these transformative shifts that have to happen. This article that I've just included here on the slide appeared in the Guardian newspaper in October of last year. And it shared a finding from Swiss Re's Index of Risk to Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Essentially, Swiss Re is an insurance and reinsurance company operating at a global level, and they have an index of risk to biodiversity and ecosystem services. And that essentially acknowledges that our natural environment and the services that it provides is absolutely fundamental to social and economic well-being, and they factor that into their risk calculations. Unfortunately for South Africa ranks near the top of that index, and being near the top of that index is not a good thing. It's a bad thing. And so when we're thinking about these shifts that we need to make as cities, a central part of those shifts has to be how we think about bringing our natural environment much more centrally into those changes. And so with that as a bit of context, so cities facing multiple challenges, this issue around the need for transformation and how we bring the environment more strongly into that space. I'm going to share with you a little bit of work that we've been doing around really asking the question around whether rivers and what role rivers can play as possible spaces for this kind of change. Durban, the whole municipal area, has more than 7,000 kilometers of rivers within its boundary. And those rivers play a critical role in delivering ecosystem services that are vital for human well-being and for the economy. And already those are significantly compromised through pollution, through land use change, and so on. But importantly, also, rivers actually connect people and places. If you track a river from its source in, for example, outside of Durban, some of our rivers start outside of Durban, they trace right through the city, connecting different spaces, different demographic groups, different socioeconomic groups, right down to our beaches, which are such a key tourism asset for the city. So rivers are like this common thread that runs through our cities, and as such provide potential spaces in which to act in different ways. You don't need to worry about the detail in the slide, but this was just to highlight a couple of the services that rivers provide, which are really important. So surface water supply, opportunities for recreation. Importantly, and this links to what I'll be carrying on with, is the role that they play in reducing the impact of floods. So well-managed rivers in a context of current and future climate change are absolutely critical in how we manage future flood events effectively. And so the starting point for some of the work that we've been doing, which I'm going to be sharing, is a program that exists within the municipality called the Sihlanzimvelo program. Interestingly, it's run from out of our roads engineering unit, so it's not run in an environmental unit. But Sihlanzimvelo is an integrated watercourse management program, and it involves the establishment of community cooperatives to clean and manage 5-kilometer stretches of streams. These streams are in high density areas of the city, and the work that these community cooperatives do focuses on litter removal and invasive alien plant removal. And when this project was initially established, its primary focus was really on trying to address some of the issues that were emerging around erosion and flooding. So you can imagine when a river is blocked with lots of litter or with invasive plants that have flown into it or moved into them. It causes a whole lot of blockages in the system, often resulting in blocked culverts, huge overflows of water, and significant damage to road infrastructure and various other forms of infrastructure that are so central for cities to function. So the idea with this program was to manage that and to manage those impacts. It was also around having eyes on the ground to monitor things like sewer blockages and other infrastructure issues, which in a municipality the size of Durban is often very difficult to do with the resources that we have at our disposal. But what became evident, and this program has been running for close on 9 years in a particular area within the city, is that although this was primarily established to address an engineering infrastructure issue, there were a whole lot of additional benefits that were being seen around this program. And those included improved environmental health, the improvement of biodiversity and natural environmental spaces, enhanced adaptation to climate change, so particularly around this issue of management of flooding, job creation in areas that really needed that, but also opportunities for training, for skills development, and increasing recognition that these spaces were actually becoming safer for people to engage in. People were coming back, children were coming back into those spaces, swimming, hopefully in the clean parts of the river, but they were being used more and were safer. And so when we looked at this, we asked ourselves the question, given these multiple benefits, how do we build the case for upscaling? And it was so interesting listening to what Paveen and Elizabeth were talking about in terms of building the economic case for public spaces. And essentially, we've tried to do the same, because often it's very hard to articulate the benefits that our natural environment delivers to us across the social and economic spectrum. And so we set ourselves the challenge of building the case that we could use to go to our city treasurer, that we could go to funders and say, this is something that's worth investing in because these are the benefits it delivers. We also looked to other projects running outside of the municipality. So some may know the Alla River, the Durban Green Corridors project run through links with our economic development unit, work happening in the Palmeet River, and all of these programs often run by conservancies, some through partnerships with the city, were being run using different models, different ways to involve communities, different ways of partnering. So we tried to also look at that and bring that into our thinking about how we might upscale this kind of river management work across the scale of the municipal area. And so out of that arose a vision for a transformative riverine management program that would ultimately, and this is incredibly ambitious, and I think will be beyond my tenure in the municipality, but some of the principles of that really aiming for full coverage of streams, enhancing our riverine functioning, enhancing adaptation, generating social, economic and opportunity, ensuring gender sensitivity, which often is a challenge and a lot of work that happens, promoting riverine stewardship, so both in terms of communities living around river spaces, but also organizations working in those spaces and partnering, which is so key to effecting these big changes that we need to see. And importantly, adopting a system scale approach. So not only upscaling, but looking at the surrounding system that is actually affecting the quality of our rivers. So I want to share with you a little bit about the business case itself, because quite a lot of work has gone into trying to articulate this particular case. And a business case really tries to provide the motivation for investing in a project based on the benefits that it delivers. So it tries to take things which are often hard to articulate and to put them in clear, often monetary terms. And there are a lot of problems with that, particularly in the environmental space. So I don't think they're the answer to everything, but they definitely provide a communication mechanism to motivate for some of the work that needs to happen. We partnered with the C40. many of you might know, C40, a big climate change, global climate change structure that links cities around the world around climate change action. This C40 recognized that a lot of cities were battling to articulate and bring projects, climate adaptation and climate mitigation projects, to the point of being finance ready. And so they set up what's called the C40 Cities Finance Facility, which essentially helps cities and provides them with technical support, so not funding, but technical support to build the financial case for investing in certain projects. Durban was quite different because most of C40's projects, most of the CFF's projects had been focused on hard infrastructure, on things like commuter systems and bus rapid transit systems. And Durban argued that actually our natural environment is equally important in how we think about climate adaptation. And so please help us to build that business case, as challenging as we knew it would be. And so we set out to develop an evidence-based rationale for upscaling investment in a transformative riverine management program, with the aim of building climate resilience, contributing to sustainable municipal service delivery, and really trying to limit climate risks and impacts to society. And at the same time, trying to secure financial, socioeconomic, human, and ecological benefits through this kind of work. So some of the outcomes of that work, what that showed was that there are significant costs of climate change impacts. This was obviously looking just at rivers, and obviously the data was quite limited. So in many respects, these numbers are huge underestimates. We looked predominantly at the damage that was being caused by river flooding to municipal infrastructure like road culverts. So that was the predominant thing where we had good data, but obviously floods will damage a whole lot of other infrastructure as well. And then we looked at estimates of lost productivity and well-being to riverine communities, so people living close to rivers, but also to downstream users, particularly on the sort of in the coastal region. You can imagine, for example, when a significant flood comes down, we see roads damaged, we see bridges washed away. That has a huge impact on people's ability to be productive in their respective spaces of work. And the estimates there are that climate change impacts cost the city about 375 million rand each year, or will by 2040. And that's made up of that component of damage to culverts, but also lost productivity to riverine and coastal communities. When we looked at the case for upscaling the existing Sihlanzimvelo program, the business case suggests that for every R1 spent, we can retrieve about R2.60 benefit back in terms of those benefits. And I'm not going to literally read all the numbers to you, but for a particular investment, so 92 million rand in terms of investment from the municipality, we can avoid a whole lot of costs in the spaces that I've mentioned. In addition to that, this kind of work has quite significant job creation potential. So upscaling Sihlanzimvelo, and this is just on municipal owned land, has the potential to create almost 1,600 jobs through about 230 odd cooperatives, and also significant additional green economy growth opportunities, particularly in the space of how we use, for example, the waste that comes out of our rivers. There's already some innovative work and piloting happening within our economic development unit around how one uses that to produce things like pavers and so on. We also looked at the case for citywide transformative riverine management, so across different land ownership types. These numbers are fairly generic and are pretty rough, but this was really asking the question, if you were to take that Sihlanzimvelo model and improve it, so to look not only at the way it currently works, but how one might use river spaces for participation, for creation of pocket parks, for natural areas enhancement, what would that look like, and what would that look like at scale? And the benefit and the business case again suggests that it's a valuable investment. So for every R1 spent, between R1.80 and R3.40 return on that, and that's just linked to the difference there is linked to the social discount rates that are applied. So the key messages that came out of this for us is that there's a good business case for it, multiple benefits, good opportunities for climate change risk reduction, but also opportunities to enhance green economy opportunities. But we have to think about how this is governed, how one begins to connect partners, and how one phases this, because this is a huge task, and how we look at appropriate partnering. We've also done some interesting things alongside this. We've developed a climate change course, which is now being tested in the municipality. And we've formed important partnerships and learning networks, which I think is also important when we think about transformation. We need to be sharing what we're learning and doing, not only with our neighboring municipalities, but in Durban's case, we've been doing it a lot with our with other African cities. Our next steps, so this is really just the first little baby step. We need to develop a detailed implementation plan that translates that into practical steps. And we've got some support to do that, and also then to explore additional funding opportunities, both within the municipality, but also externally to try and support this work. So just finally, in closing, you know, I started by asking the question really around whether this kind of work has the potential for changing aspects of our cities. And when I reflect on the potential, and again, this is potential because we haven't actually done the work yet. We've only got a project running in part of the city. But there is, I think, potential for quite significant shifts. For me, some of the important things are that if one really prioritized investment in our rivers, it would flip the system on its head. It would really centralize the role of environment as key infrastructure for the city. So when we talk about infrastructure, it's not just roads and bridges. Our environment is key infrastructure. We need to be implementing at scale. So the fact that this is at scale has transformation potential and has opportunities for broader economic inclusion. It has opportunities for improved skills development, enhancing green economy opportunities, but also opportunities to focus on social inclusion and issues around gender. And importantly, as part of any transformation that we think about, partnering, learning and knowledge generation, and the ability to achieve multiple benefits simultaneously within an intervention are absolutely key in a context where we are facing so many challenges and where resources are scarce. So I hope to be able to share some of this maybe at another opportunity. As I said, we're at the beginning of the journey, but really just trying to emphasize the role of our natural environment as a potential space for some of the important things that we've been thinking about and talking about this morning. Thanks, Aki.
Thank you so much, Joe, for a very informative presentation. Who would have known that being on top of the index is not a good thing? Only the environmentalists could tell you that. It is good to know that we now need to change the way we approach the infrastructure and also put an environmental cases or environmental as a key infrastructure asset in order to make sure that we do benefit from taking care of our green areas and ensure that we create that platform where we can activate or invest in our public open space. The good about all of the presentation is there are key common things that are coming to play, wherein we all seem to be agreeing that we are not doing enough in capitalizing our open spaces, the natural environment that God has given to us, to ensure that it reunites and regenerates our cities, and ensuring that our people are party or are partner to what planning for inclusive cities, and ensuring that there is a paradigm shift in terms of ensuring that there is an access to the open spaces and do away with exclusivity. When Puven was mentioning that, I actually laughed because I was doing the research in the city, and I see a lot of signs where they require you to be a club member. That is exclusivity that we are trying to do away with and try to capitalize and to ensure that open spaces is accessible to all of us. Colleagues, may I take a few questions and comments? A hand from Pegani, please shoot.
Okay, thank you, Chair, for an opportunity, and thank you to Joe for such an insightful presentation. Yeah, I think it was a cool presentation indeed, because it gives us another lens of approaching inclusive cities, because I think our inclusive cities will not be sustainable. Our inclusive cities are going to be in vain if we don't incorporate the environmental aspects in them. Because we have been talking about socio-economic or socio-political, approaches towards inclusive cities, forgetting that those socio-political and socio-economic approaches, are barely without the effect on the environment. And without the natural environment, without the natural resources that Joe has spoken to us about, there is no future, there's no tomorrow. There's no tomorrow. We can successfully have everybody have access to the city, but if the environment, natural environment is not taken care of, there is no tomorrow. The food that we need for tomorrow will come from the environment. The houses that we need for tomorrow will come from the environment. The clothes and everything that we need comes from the natural environment. So what does that mean? It means that we need to incorporate the environmental aspect in every decision, in every approach that we take as we think or as we strive for inclusive cities. So it's not a comment per se, but it's just an additional input on what Joe has presented, that the presentation is very insightful. It gives us an indication of the sustainability of inclusive cities. The question of these inclusive cities appearing or rather existing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pegani, for your inputs. Can I read through the question before I take another hand? There's a question from Robino Aka, which says he needs to find out if a land use system followed along riverine areas. What about the case along the coastal areas belt? So he'd like to have that insight from Joe.
Thanks, Aki. I can try and answer that. I think other colleagues might be better placed. And I hope I'm understanding the question. I mean, the coastal zone, as you say, is equally important in terms of that coastal corridor. And in Durban, the coastal corridor is actually under extreme threat from not only sort of on the seaward side rising seas, but also development pressure. And so obviously there are land use systems in place to try and manage that. There are also things like coastal management lines and coastal management zones, which are in different stages of development at various levels of government. But that becomes a critical part of this bigger sort of systemic picture if we're talking about rivers, because if we don't manage that coastal area, obviously that's equally important. So yes, there are land use plans and instruments in place, but increasing pressure for obvious reasons. And I think many coastal cities are facing those challenges. And so managing and balancing the need for development and the need for cities to generate rates and taxes and so on, but with the fact that those coastal zones as well as our riverine systems are actually incredibly vulnerable and need to be managed appropriately.
Thank you, Joe. Any colleagues who want to have a bite on the same issue?
Zaki, if you don't mind me just responding, I see there's a question in the chat box. Can I respond to that?
Yes, please.
So Gareth has asked a question around, prioritizing these issues and whether we're too late. And I think it's a very important question. I think you're right, Gareth. I think this is what we're trying to do through this work. It remains to be seen whether we'll be successful, but is to prioritize this kind of work. But importantly, this kind of work of managing rivers does not sit in isolation from some of the bigger systemic issues around land use planning, changes in land use patterns which are affecting our rivers. And in Durban, one of the big challenges currently is management of our sewage treatment works and the reticulation systems that support those. So I think it's also very important not to, while I've sort of presented part of the story, in many ways, if we only do what I've said in this presentation, we will still lose the battle, because many of the impacts in the broader system are really significant. And so we're facing those challenges also from an infrastructure perspective in Durban. So one really has to look at the whole system, and that's a huge challenge because, and I think Begani in his input also kind of highlighted all the ways in which so many of these systems are connected. So it's really hard. So I hope we're not too late. But for me, I always like to think, well, we need to keep going and we need to start. And we need to keep putting pressure on the system to shift, at least in some way, that moves us to a better place. Thanks, Saki.
Thank you, Joe. I don't see any hands, colleagues. If people are struggling with raising the hand, they can just shoot out because I don't see any here. If there is no one, I believe I should go back. I'll take them. I should hand over to the chair, Martin, to take over from now. Martin, are you still around?
Yes, I'm still here.
Yes.
Excuse me. Yes, what an interesting discussion we had. What interesting presentations we had. I really want to thank all the presenters for your valuable inputs. It really made this seminar such an interesting one, and I would love to go and re-listen to the YouTube recording that would be there. Because I think that there's just so many things that have been said. I'm not sure if one would be able to grasp or take in everything at once, because I think the information is so much. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for the participants that were part of this group. Because without you, the presenters would only be speaking to one or two of us. So thank you very much for your attendance as well. I do hope that you did include or did fill in the registration form. There was a link provided in the chat, so just go for that as well, and make sure that you do fill that in. I see there's another. Yeah, that link has just been provided again. So please, if you haven't filled that in, please do fill that in. I think it's important that we keep that as well. I just want to see there's a. Yeah, there's also a comment from Pavena Kia in the chat. The later we implement potential solutions, the more costly the interventions from socio-economic and environmental perspective. There is, therefore, it is in the interest of all that these risks are identified early as possible and a transferal approach to addressing the challenges is adopted. So yes, thank you very much for that as well. Then a very, very excellent point. Also, Joe confirmed that. I think this is then the end of this session. I'm not sure if there's any of the other sessions that's still running. I see our time is nearly up as well. So again, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organizers. You would see them on the program, the list of organizers there. All the participants, my co-chair, thank you very much for chairing the second half of the session as well. And hopefully we will be seeing you tomorrow. Tomorrow, day 3, that's the last day, where we will be starting again at 9 o'clock. And there will be a panel discussion. So I would urge everybody, if you can, please also link into that. And so that, because I think I saw the panelists and the panel facilitator, I think it's really going to be an interesting discussion, especially what we have heard over the past 2 days. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a lovely day further, and stay safe.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.